Hello, everyone. We'll make a start for today. I hope you can all hear me clearly and see the slides. We're just still people still filtering in, but I'll just start with a brief introduction before our first speaker, and then hopefully by the time our first speaker starts, everyone else will have been able to join. So welcome to the third Cambridge Zero Research Symposium this term. Our theme today is resources and production, and the program for today covers lots of different aspects of this theme, from sustainable fuels, sustainable chemicals, industry or sustainable industrial system, through to agriculture and other topics as well. So here's the program for today, program of speakers. So we've got, I'm not going to read everyone's titles out because the titles will come up as we go through, but we've got Erwin Reisner, Steve Evans and Howard Griffiths giving the keynote presentations today. And then Pratheeba Vimalnath, Christopher Cleaver, Christian Pichler, Emily Servanté, Thea Jung, and Carla Cervantes Baron are the postgraduate and early career researchers presenting their work at today's symposium. So those they'll each be giving their presentations, and there'll be time for Q&A after each of the speakers. We also, because we had lots of submissions for today's symposium, we also have some pre-recorded presentations from 4 more postgraduate and early career researchers: Taylor Oikert, Jasmine Jahik, Livei Chow, and Michael Weinold. And you should have received the links to these presentations in the emails that were sent out before the symposium. So I hope that some of you have had a chance to watch these presentations already. And the presenters of these presentations are on the call today, so they are also able to answer any questions you may have for them through the Q&A. So I'll just quickly mention the rules for the Q&A. So you should be able to find the Q&A box in the bottom Zoom panel bar at the bottom there, and you can submit questions in the Q&A at any point during the session today. You can also upvote questions. So if you see that someone else has asked a question that you would like answered, you can upvote it, and so it comes to the top of the list. And we will then moderate the questions and put those to the speakers after their presentations. And hopefully there'll be enough time for them to answer those questions live. But if we don't have enough time, then the speakers can also type written answers directly into the Q&A box. So hopefully we should be able to get through all your questions. And as I say, please also ask questions of the presenters from the pre-recorded presentations, as they're also here and able to answer your calls. But please say whose the question is aimed at when you ask your question in the Q&A. I should also note that the session is being recorded, and we will share the recording of this session on our YouTube channel and our website afterwards. Then just to add that today is the third in our series of research symposia for this term. So we already had the Zero Carbon Energy Transformation and Health and Society Symposia in the past 2 weeks, and recordings of those symposia are available on our website if you want to catch up. And we then have 3 more symposia coming up in the next few weeks on resilient and sustainable futures, transport, cities and infrastructure, and carbon drawdown and climate repair. And you're of course all very welcome to attend those as well. So please do register on our website at the link at the bottom there, and we will share that link with you after today as well. So that's most of it from me for now. Just to say that, as I just said, please register for our upcoming symposia in the coming few weeks. And there's another event there on the 2nd of March from the Centre for Digital Built Britain that links into the transport, cities and infrastructure theme, which you're also welcome to sign up for. Please do also join our Cambridge Zero research mailing list. The link to that will also be sent out to you after today. And please do also follow us on Twitter. So without taking up any more of our time today, I would like to then hand over to our first speaker for today, who is Professor Erwin Reisner from the Department of Chemistry. So Erwin, over to you, and feel free to share your screen.
Great, thanks a lot, Eric, for introductory words. Also thanks to Antoinette and the Cambridge Zero team. It's really nice to see all these webinars coming along and all the great work you've been doing so far. So I will share my screen. I'm Professor of Energy and Sustainability in the now Yusuf Hamid Department of Chemistry here in Cambridge. And my research group or laboratory really works on solar chemistry. So what we try to do is we try to use sunlight as an energy input to produce sustainable fuels and chemicals. And of course, here the ambition would be that we can make chemicals and fuels renewably rather than making them from fossil fuels, what is happening at the moment. And before I go into a bit more of the details, I just want to justify in very brief and simple terms why we're interested in solar light and why I'm interested in fuels and chemicals. So the solar energy aspect is probably generally well known. So solar energy is abundant, meaning if we take the efficiencies of today's photovoltaic panels of about 20%, you would only need to cover about 0.1% of the land surface area to produce enough energy to power the planet, to produce the energy that's being used by humans on the planet. So 0.1% of land area. It's quite doable and seems possible. What may be less well known in the general public is that solar energy has become very cheap. So the price of electricity produced from photovoltaics has come down by about 80% in the last 10 years. And in many areas of the world is now cheaper or even at the same price as fossil fuels. So it has really become an economical technology that is being rolled out very quickly now, I'm confident, in the future. But there's also a case for fuels. Why are we interested in making fuels? I've just made the case for photovoltaics, which are great and deserve all the support. But if we look at the global power demand of about 20 terawatts, and I believe these numbers are from 2019, then electricity only covers quite a small amount, so roughly 4 terawatts, depending, of course, of the source you look like, but it's usually about 20 to 30% of energy is being used to make electricity. And the vast majority is being used to make fuels. And if you look at the energy portfolio to make energy sustainable, for electricity, it's mainly photovoltaics, wind, hydroelectric, and others, whereas we do not really have good means to make fuels on a very large scale, besides some of the biofuels possibly, but it's certainly not enough to cover global demand. So we believe there's a big need for sustainable fuels in the future, and that's something we try to tackle in the chemistry department. So what do we try to do? I mentioned solar chemistry, and if we want to make fuels and chemicals, we want to make them from the simplest building blocks, and those building blocks or feedstocks that are widely available, or in fact that we want to mitigate in the form of waste. So all of our chemistry starts from water, H2O, carbon dioxide, which you can use from exhaust gas or even ideally extract from the atmosphere, of course, as a greenhouse gas, or waste. And when it comes to waste, we are mainly interested in biomass and plastics waste. At the moment, I'm sure we've all heard of the plastics crisis. So there's a lot of scope to recycle more of the plastics and do something good with it. And when it comes to biomass, we are particularly interested in lignocellulose, which is a non-edible form of biomass, which again implies we do not intend to compete with agriculture or food production. This is really food waste, ideally, that we cannot use by other means. And this is now where the chemistry comes in. So can we use these feedstocks and can we convert it into energy carriers? And our main goal is here at the moment to produce 3 different types of energy carriers. The first one would be hydrogen, which could of course be used in the much talked about hydrogen economy. If we think about hydrogen and we see some fuel cell buses driving in London and elsewhere, it says in big letters it's emission CO2 neutral or no environmental impact. This is of course true for at the moment of emission or combustion of the hydrogen in the fuel cell, but it's not true for the production. At the moment, still 96% of hydrogen is being produced from fossil fuels, emitting large quantities of CO2. So we still require technologies to produce hydrogen. Other energy carriers, potentially even more interesting than hydrogen for us, is carbon monoxide or formic acid. These are much less being talked about, but they also contain a similar amount of energy. And even more important for us is they contain carbon. So they really get us into the carbon chemistry. If we think about making carbon-based building blocks, carbon monoxide and formic acid are great starting points. And if we can make these 3 building blocks, we believe we can make quite a large chemical portfolio of compounds. So for example, one possible output would be liquid fuels or hydrocarbons, which you could also term green gasoline or kerosene, because you can convert hydrogen and carbon monoxide with Fischer-Tropsch chemistry that's established into hydrocarbons. You can make alcohols from these compounds, and you can also make all sorts of chemicals, including plastics, fertilizer, and you see this dots here. You can go much further. You can even think about the steel manufacturing, where you could replace some of the coal by renewable hydrogen and also make steel far more sustainable than at present. And of course, you can just convert it back into electricity. I think the main message here is whatever you do with your output, if we can make these sustainable, it would really only go back and again release water, carbon dioxide, and waste. And this really brings us to a potential circular economy where we start off with the most basic building blocks. We make something of interest like fuels or chemicals, and once they're being utilized, we just form our input back and go in a circle rather than a linear economy where you start off with fossil fuels and release CO2, and that's the end of your process. So what I would like to do today in the short time I have available is really just show 3 prototype systems to give you an idea how the solar chemistry could look like, as many of you may not be familiar. And again, please keep in mind, this is all proof of principles. What I'm going to show you are systems that indeed work and operate and function, but they're not commercially viable at present, right? We are still a long way to go, but we hope in the mid or long term, we can actually make a contribution. So the first is the solar reforming of waste polymers. And with waste, I introduce biomass and plastics. So the idea is here, can we have an aqueous process where we just add our waste polymers in the presence of one of these photocatalysts that we develop in the laboratory? So when we think of a photocatalyst, this is something that accelerates a chemical reaction and is driven by light. So this means it can also drive chemical reactions that are energetically uphill. And that's the case for many of the reactions we need here. It's not the case actually for the biomass, but for everything else I'm showing today, it's energy uphill. And then of course we need sunlight as the energy source. These photocatalysts are semiconducting materials. We use a very wide range from classical, more inorganic type of semiconductors to carbon-based semiconductors that are far more benign and environmentally friendly. And then the idea is when this photocatalyst takes up the light, it has enough energy to break down our waste polymers, release hydrogen from the aqueous solution, and start converting the waste into chemicals, which we hope to extract in the longer term future. I would like to point to Taylor Ukert, who has done a lot of this work here, and she has the recording online already on the plastic conversion. And also Christian Pichler is working on this topic, and he will give a presentation in about 1 hour, I believe, on the conversion of biomass. So I will not talk more about the details of this process. But again, just to illustrate the simplicity of this technology, here there are 2 forms of biomass. Two forms of this waste. On the left-hand side, we have wood to represent the biomass. On the right-hand side, PET to represent plastics. And what you can see on the left is this piece of wood inside a test tube. And we have this yellow solution. And this solution is an aqueous, as in water, and contains some base. And the yellow color is from our photocatalyst. So the photocatalyst needs to be colored to take up some of the sunlight. And when we switch on this light source, we can see now that something is happening. And specifically what we see is that slowly we start forming these bubbles. Right? And these bubbles are hydrogen gas that's coming out. So this means this photocatalyst really can now slowly eat, if you like, or use simple terminology, into the wood, start evolving hydrogen and breaks down the biomass. And actually it works quite vigorously. So you can really see the hydrogen bubbles clearly coming out. I should also say this light source is not a high-powered laser. This is really simulated solar light. So it would represent more or less the light intensity and spectrum of a decent UK summer day. Not today, but in summer we will have days that represent that. And I can show the same for PET, so polyethylene terephthalate. This would be the type of plastic that makes drinking bottles, for example. And all we have here is a slice of drinking bottle, indeed, so chopped up. It's coated with these photocatalysts. And here it's exactly the same again. Once we expose this to light, you can see these bubbles of hydrogen coming slowly out and being released. So it's bubbles being formed. But again, just to give you an idea, these systems need to be far more efficient. Even after a week, we have still not fully converted the plastics or the wood here. It just takes a very long time. It just shows the system works, but it needs further improvement. So what about, before I move on, just one word about plastics. So there has been a lot of activity on in particular the elimination of plastic waste more broadly in Cambridge. And I'm very happy to say that we could start a center in the beginning of 2019 on this topic. It's called the Cambridge Circular Plastics Center, or short Surplus, and it really has the ambition here to create a community on the circular economy of plastics here in Cambridge. And it has already brought together from the start 8 departments. You can see here the core team of 10 academics spread over all different schools, and it's constantly growing. So there's a real nice community starting from the physical sciences to engineering, social sciences that work together to address many of the issues we face. We support multidisciplinary research activities, and ultimately the ambition would be to have some longer term impact on society, environment, policy, and business. And just to give you a brief idea on the activities, so we have 4 goals, and the first goal in particular would be the development of cleaner and recyclable alternatives to synthetic plastics, in particular biomass or cellulose derived plastics. So can we take biomass to make plastics rather than make them from fossil fuels? That's one work package. One would be to look for new innovations for plastics recycling. So you've seen the solar recycling on the last slide. This is my contribution. But we also have, for example, Adrian Fisher working on the conversion of plastics to produce sustainable electricity, or at least more renewable electricity. And Jeremy Baumberg, for example, tries to use plastic waste for 3D printing. And then we also look at understanding of plastic materials flows, especially in engineering, and much more broadly on the behavior, legislation, techno-economical analysis, and the circular economy of plastics as well. So I think it's a very nice package. Look at the challenges from a very broad perspective. And it has really been fun and engaging to be part of that center. So what about other ways? I mentioned the challenge to convert carbon dioxide into something useful. And this is here what's also termed as an artificial leaf. So in many ways, it mimics natural leaf simply because it's very thin. It's like a sheet of paper. And it in a way mimics what the leaf is doing, that's converting carbon dioxide into some energy carrier. And that's work finished here by Virgil Andre. And what he could show here, we can really take carbon dioxide and water. This means it's an aqueous solution that's saturated with carbon dioxide. And when you shine light, you can indeed produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And I should have said this gas mixture is known as syngas. And when I mentioned before, we can make potentially hydrocarbons from carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, it is precisely the syngas mixture that you would require to do so. And how this works is, this is a layered approach. So we select first really suitable light absorbers that can take as much of the solar energy as possible. Very often we rely on semiconductors from the photovoltaics field of research. So for example, perovskites would be one material we use here. The second one we have in this particular system is bismuth vanadate, and they are sandwiched in between the catalysts that drive this reaction. And you can see here on this brief video on the bottom, again, a very simple demonstration. So this leaf would be here in this glass cell. Again, simulated solar light comes from the left, and you can see some bubbles emerging here as well. I'm sorry to show so many bubbles, but it's just a nice illustration, and I think it gives away the idea how this works. And here, these are really the syngas bubbles that are coming out. Also here, please note, this is 100 times speed. So we are not looking at a high performance system. All we are demonstrating is here, you can indeed take a saturated solution of water with CO2 and have a standalone device that generates syngas. So there's no external applied voltage, there's no trick, there's no added chemical that drives the reaction. This really just works from CO2 and water and nothing else. And this also means we co-produce oxygen. It's the side product of the reaction. It's a technicality, but also oxygen is being generated here. And last but not least, looking quite similarly, and if you see myself, my whole background is this panel as well. This is work from Jian Wang, and these are these solar sheets or photocatalyst sheets of the size at the moment about 25 square centimeter. They look very similar to the sleeves I've shown you before from Virgil, but the technology is quite different. All we have here is a conducting substrate where we deposit some semiconducting powders. And these semiconducting powders, again, are well selected to absorb as much light as possible. In this case, it's bismuth vanadate and strontium titanate. And now we can just decorate these catalysts or these semiconductors with suitable catalysts to convert carbon dioxide into our compound of choice. And in this case, we have selected a catalyst that can make formic acid. And I've mentioned before as well, formic acid is a really interesting platform chemical. You can use it as a storage for hydrogen. but you could also use it, for example, directly in a fuel cell. There are many possibilities here as well. Okay, these are the three systems I wanted to demonstrate in the short amount of time I have available. Just summarizing here and giving a bit of an outlook. So what I've shown is, indeed, we have these prototype systems. It's in principle feasible to use sunlight with standalone systems to convert waste and carbon dioxide into energy carriers and fuels. But again, there are many limitations. And when we go to limitations, some of those I've pointed out already, we really need to improve the performance, robustness, efficiency, etc. of these systems. So if we just think about the catalysis, we are getting quite good to make the syngas, to make hydrogen, to make formic acid. But would it not be fantastic if we could go straight from carbon dioxide to a transport fuel in one step? I mean, this is what I'm saying now is not yet feasible, but it would be great if you could just take CO2 into kerosene, right, for transportation or for flight or aviation. Or can we at least go to higher alcohols? If we do not make just methanol, ethanol, but actually can push it potentially to butanol, hexanol, then we have an alcohol that phase separates from water, and we can very easily separate it from our process. So these are things we are thinking about, and we are developing the technology in this direction. And of course, production of pure, interesting organic chemicals. Can actually we start supplying not only the petrochemical industry with feedstocks, but even the pharma industry and others with bulk chemicals. So it's all about catalysis and improving this aspect of the work, one of the core focuses at the moment. Efficiency, as I mentioned, a few bubbles per hour will not cut it in the end. And this is the result of really only at the moment in many systems converting about 0.1% of the solar energy into our product. So it's like photovoltaics. If you go back 60, 70 years ago, where they were working but at very low performance, here also our performance efficiency is low. To become commercially relevant, we need to go to the 10+% conversion efficiency. That's targets we have set, and we want to get there eventually. And of course, stability. I've shown this solar reforming of waste. These systems work for a week. The sheet and leaf systems maybe more for hours to days. But again, for any commercial prospects, we need to go to years ultimately. What you can see here on the bottom is really just some of the systems and devices we are producing. Very often, in particular, Virgil Andre is very keen on the 3D printed cells. They don't look particularly well built, but they're extremely versatile, and we can optimize them very quickly. So when the students do an experiment during the day, we can make the alteration in the afternoon, print overnight, and the next day have the next cell. But of course, ultimately, you want to have gas-tight devices, so this will be better engineered, and scaling is also becoming important. So our largest devices at the moment are about 20 × 30 centimeter, to give you an idea of the area. Of course, if you want to produce fuel, we are talking square kilometers very easily. Okay, I think my time is running out, so I would actually like to stop here. I've acknowledged 4 members of my team. This has been quite a significant effort. If we just take the syngas reactor as an example, this is work that started in 2012. It took us 8 years just to show the demonstration that we can do and build such a standalone device. But even more exciting it is now that we have these systems. So once you have a prototype, it's actually much easier and quicker to build up from there, to develop better catalysts and efficiencies. And this really was thanks to a very large cohort of fantastic students and postdocs here. And the funding sources are also summarized here. And thanks a lot for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, and I hope that I'm on time.
Thank you very much, Erwin, for a great talk. We've got some questions here coming in, which we can go through quickly. So there's the first question here from Gary asking about solar chemistry. What are the barriers to commercialization of solar-derived fuels, and can we follow the paths established for first-generation biofuels?
Yeah, so I think the main limitation is simply there is at the moment no commercial application of it. It's very early days. And I think one main challenge is simply the areas you need. It's, all the technologies we have at the moment are quite condensed in a way, right? You either have high pressure reactors, and you can do everything at quite a small area and very concentrated. For solar chemistry, all of this starts to change very significantly. You start to think now about laying out large land areas. All these limitations I've just mentioned are completely unresolved because it's quite a new field of research. And also what we have to start thinking about then once we start producing our products, how do we collect this, right? I mean, I've just said before very nicely, let's make kerosene. But then if you have this kerosene distributed over square kilometers, also somehow you need to concentrate it again. So for us chemists, we developed the basic science. We're really excited about this, but I also recognize engineering is becoming more and more important and really to think about these steps. And I think it's for the field in general. I mean, this is a massive field by now. It is going towards engineering, and we are only starting to scratching the surface in the challenges we are facing. I think the potential is huge, but since it's a very different way of technology, it will require a lot of alterations of what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll do one more question live quickly, and then we'll have to move on. But there's two questions here from Arwin together, who's asking, how would it be possible to separate the gases that are formed, and is it possible to quantify them as well?
Yes, so quantification is very easy. So in our case, we measure them by the gases, in particular by gas chromatography. So we have a very clear handle. Sorry, the presentation was not particularly scientific. So all I've showed is bubbles. But of course, we measure the amounts of gases we produce and have a very clear handle and understanding of what we're doing, I hope at least. The gases, in fact, we do not want to separate. So I think one really important aspect I did not mention is the hydrogen, for example, from the waste reforming is very clean. And this is a huge advantage over many of the other waste conversion technologies. So if you convert waste by heat treatment, like pyrolysis, you do not end up with clean hydrogen. You have a mixture of many other impurities. This means this hydrogen you cannot use in a fuel cell. And that's a big drawback. Then you need to go to purification, etc. Our hydrogen is highly clean. So this means we believe it's clean enough to drive a fuel cell. We've just hope to start a project, in fact, with a small fuel cell company to demonstrate this, but it's a clean gas. When it comes to syngas, this carbon monoxide and hydrogen mixture, we also don't want to separate it. We want to keep it together, as I mentioned, to go into this Fischer-Tropsch chemistry and make the hydrocarbons. The only fuel, or the only gas we want to separate is the oxygen. But this, if you think about the artificial leaf, then we would generate anyway, at least in this one design, oxygen on one side and the carbon monoxide and hydrogen on the other side. So it's already physically separated.
Okay, great, thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to move on, but there's one more question here from Charlie asking about whether the photocatalysts are sustainably produced. So maybe you could answer that one, type an answer to that one. That would be great.
I can do it very quickly. I think it's quite interesting. Okay. 20 seconds. So we started off with highly unsustainable materials like cadmium-containing semiconductors. That's what we don't want to use. But the latest type of photocatalyst is really exciting because we can just take biomass waste, heat treat this biomass waste to make a carbon-based semiconductor, and then use this carbon-based semiconductor made from biomass to solar reform biomass to make hydrogen. So at the moment, we are really at the stage where we can make this photocatalyst extremely sustainably.
Wow, okay, great. Thanks for doing that quickly. Okay, well, thank you very much, Erwin, for your talk and for answering this question. That was great. And now to the next speaker for today, who's Steve Evans from the Institute for Manufacturing. So Steve, over to you. And I see you're already sharing your screen.
And I'm hoping that everybody can see.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, it is absolutely fantastic and daunting to be sandwiched between two such eminent scientists. And I am one of those boring engineers, Erwin, and I even answer more boring questions than trying to scale up fantastic emerging technologies. I'm trying to answer the question, what works and what doesn't work if we are going to build a sustainable industrial system? And some of that is very short term. I'm going to give some quick answers to that. And some of it is what might we need to do in the medium term and long term after we've solved some of those short-term puzzles. So this is the time to go and get a cup of coffee, unless you're incredibly interested in problems of efficiency. We have other names for these programs. I sometimes refer to it as the stop doing stupid stuff research. Quite important, but yeah, not quite as wonderful as we've seen. So I'm going to be talking dominantly this afternoon about efficiency, with some conversation about how we might change the way we deliver value as an industrial system and how we might conduct some system change. I'm going to take climate change as the one-dimensional proxy for all things sustainable, because we have a very clear target. We'd like to reach net zero by 2050. But please bear in mind that these answers resolve to all of the dimensions of sustainability, including social sustainability and things like north-south equity and land use. So, efficiency. If this was a normal presentation, I'd be standing up and waving around my jeans and say that my pair of jeans has been made in a factory in Vietnam, where we were trying to help them find ways of reducing the amount of water it takes to make one pair of jeans. Traditionally, it takes about 800 liters. At the time we started working with this organization, the world record was 435 liters. Now, if you go into a factory and you see jeans going out, bang, 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 and multiply that by 435 liters in the very best factory in the world, you realize that jeans factories require rivers. That's the sort of numbers that we're talking about. We didn't set the target of 434 in order to become the world champions, but where did we end up? We ended up using 1 liter of water to make one pair of jeans. Now we can actually make jeans away from a river. This is now a small enough number that you can make jeans from the water that falls on the roof of the factory. How did we do this? We didn't spend buckets of money. Sorry to use buckets. I didn't mean to imply that. We didn't use lots and lots of money to solve this problem. We got people problem solving within the factory, identifying opportunities to reduce. So I'm going to try and tell you that the opportunity for delivering a sustainable world starts with not being inefficient in the way we use resources. So let's try and answer this question. What if every factory matched the most resource efficient factory in its own sector? So we've actually tried to do this analysis. So just take the best one today. At the time, that would have been the 435 liters of water used in that denim jeans factory. We know how much the best factory that makes cars, how much energy it takes them to make one car, and we know how much energy the other companies use to make their cars. What would happen if every company moved to the best in its own sector? 24% more profit, because they're buying less energy, material, and water. They're processing less waste, 9% less greenhouse gases, and 30% more jobs. So this is good, 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 win, win, win. Why aren't we doing more of it is a really interesting research question. We might take that up in the debate in Q&A, but we also studied that. You might be wondering, why is it more jobs? Because if you want to be materially efficient, if you want to grow less cotton in order to make those jeans, if you want to mine less iron in order to keep buildings structurally sound, you need to recycle the iron and the cotton that's already in the system, and recycling tends to be job intensive. It's less highly automated than the linear production system that we are used to. So for a while, until we learn to automate these jobs, becoming circular in the way we use materials tends to generate more jobs. Politically, I think that's quite a nice thing to do for the next couple of decades. Now, we know we need to get on a pathway that is an extreme change in direction from where we are currently heading. And I've just taken this picture because I like the colors in this particular graphic. You can get various versions of future scenarios of how we might reach different temperature endpoints depending on the pathways that we end up on. If we want to get on the best pathway, we need to get on it now. We cannot wait a decade until some major technological revolution comes along and start implementing that technology, because the downward path is too steep. I'm going to suggest that if we are to deliver the 7 to 10% annual reduction needed if we start in 2021, half of that can be delivered through stop doing stupid stuff. So we're halfway to our goal, and at the same time, we're increasing profit, generating jobs, and most importantly, generating learning. That's the really important bit. We need to learn how to do this better, and you need this learning in order to design stage 2 and stage 3 of the journey. And what we seem to be stuck with is a desire not to start the journey until we know what stage 3 looks like. I'm really impatient. I'd like us to start stage 1, gain some of the benefits, gain some of the learning, and that will allow us to design stage 2 and 3. It sets the scene for Erwin's research. For example, if we can reduce the load, if we can deliver the equivalent of 3 liter per 100 kilometer cars, 94 mile per gallon cars, it means that Erwin doesn't necessarily have to reach 10%. Maybe we can do a good job at 7%. And that would be a fantastic thing. And that technology is going to arrive earlier because it's profitable at a different level of efficiency. Now, I just want to say to you that 94 mile per gallon cars, 3 liters per 100 kilometers, were on sale in the European market in 2003. We know how to make 100 mile per gallon cars, but you cannot buy them. So there's a different problem out there that we are trying to solve. And that's the problem of value. The car companies know how to make 100 mile per gallon cars, but they don't know how to make money from them. And that's a value design problem. The way they sell cars to you now is trapped in by the discount rate that individuals employ. On average, if you save 1,000 euros of fuel when you buy a new car, you will add 1,000 euros to the price of the car. So you are looking at your future benefits and you're discounting them at the rate of 1 year. You will only add 1 year's worth of cost to gain that year's benefit, and all years after that will go into your pocket. Because of that, the car companies are unable to add the technology in that will actually save you money. And this is what we call the value trap. And how do you get around that? So some of you might be aware of the idea of fast fashion. I've seen your pictures online. You're all amazingly well dressed. And you might be aware that the average fast fashionista in the UK, that's what they're called, spends between 50 and 75 pounds a week, and their modal use for the marquee item, the number one expensive item that they buy, the modal use is 1. They will wear it one time and never, ever, ever wear it again. Now, I wonder if we could give those people a card with 20 on it, and that card entitled them to go to the shop, take 20 items home, put them in the wardrobe, and when they've worn them once, bring them back to the shop and swap them. Do not wash them. Bring back to the shop and swap. The really interesting thing is, how much is that going to cost? Well, if I said I'm going to give it to you for £30 a week, that's clearly less than the £50 a week to 75 that you're already spending. So you're saving money. It's half the price for the customer. It actually doubles the profit for the retailer. And because the same garment is effectively earning money from multiple customers, it means that we don't have to grow as much fiber at the front end, so we can halve land use and halve greenhouse gases from the growing of those fibers. So more profitable, cheaper for you, half the environmental impact. What's not to like? And this is the type of value innovation research that we do with companies, trying to help them think about how do they approach these problems and implement these ideas for themselves. Well, you might imagine that I'd have a wonderful list of technology that's going to help us reach our targets by 2050. Such things do exist, but you can't do better than listen to people like Erwin. So I'm not going to try and compete with the amazing science and technology that will come through over the next 3 decades. But I don't want to rely on it. I don't want the rest of the system to just say, hey, clever people in your labs, climate change has become your problem. What are the rest of us going to do about it? So let's think about how we might change the system in the future. And I want to leave you with an image of how manufacturing and industry might be different in the future. It's only one image. There are many different possibilities in the future. This image we call foraging factories. And this is a real life project study that was done by a company called Ecover. You may know this company. They make cleaning products largely out of plant-based source materials. So they avoid hydrocarbon, oil-based and mineral-based precursor materials, if at all possible. And they wanted to put a factory up on the island of Mallorca in the Mediterranean because they felt that they were shipping water. They'd make these products in a number of places, and actually they would just put water in them, put it in a bottle, and move what is 98% water to the island, which was ridiculous. So let's build a factory in the island. And then they come up with this, what I think is a fabulous idea. Fly a satellite over the island. that satellite can combine with weather data to identify that Farmer Jane is going to make 1,000 kilos of orange juice probably next Wednesday. But 1,000 kilos of orange juice also generates 1,000 kilos of orange pulp at the end of that process. And if we took that list of all of those wastes, we now have what I call a Friday night fridge problem. If those are all the things in the fridge, what meal can I make? You send that information back to the R&D center in Eindhoven, which is in the Netherlands. They look at the materials and say, well, if we took farmer number 1, farmer number 5, and farmer number 7's wastes, combined them with these enzymes, we make and fly those enzymes to Mallorca, to the factory, and next Friday, we will make shampoo for 0 material cost, for hardly any transport cost. All it requires is massive knowledge. This future is not people like me going around the streets looking for things to recycle, to somehow patch up holes in my wall and make a house. This is a high-tech industry that is absolutely knowledge intensive, but seeks to tread very lightly on the planet through using that knowledge. And I hope that's an exciting picture of the future. And I'm going to leave you with one last slide, because just in case you ask this question, I put a slide up. I thought somebody might say, well, Steve, you do a lot of work with a lot of organizations. What do the very best organizations do? And I'm going to suggest that their actions are in 5 streams from left to right, typically on time. The very best organizations start by listening to their stakeholders and conduct new value experiments and generate new business models, such as the renting of clothes. And the other streams speak to their use of clean energy, clean materials, innovating clean products, and being resource efficient. So we can answer the question, what do leading sustainable businesses do? I'm going to make a final point. Every one of us who's interested in living in a better world in the future, let's not ignore industry. They're part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution, and it will be a very exciting place to be. It is not going to look like the smokestack industries of the 1950s or 1850s. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Steve. And thanks for sticking to time as well. So we can move on to the Q&A's questions for Steve now. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask Steve, please put them in the Q&A box now. And we've already got one question here from Yaya Prakash, who's asking which part of the value chain of manufacturing and production would be generating the 30% job creation?
The answer is actually everywhere, because you end up with more jobs in sorting of waste materials. We all think about waste in terms of our household bins. If you imagine our household bins having a time-based piece of string following the materials until they reach the bin, that string would travel the whole world from literally thousands of factories. Your bin is the worst place in the world to solve this problem. You have got 1,000 factories putting things into one bin. When you go to the factory, the waste that goes into one bin is typically one material, or maybe 2 or even 3. It's much easier to sort. So when we talk about the waste industry, the vast majority of waste does not happen in the household. And you can see jobs there and jobs being created inside the factory, because you have to process things differently because the materials that are arriving have different operating parameters.
Okay, thank you. A few more questions have just popped up here. Someone's saying, Anshit saying, you propose a lot of revolutionary ideas to change current models. What is the kind of timeline we're looking at to actually implement some of these on a wide scale?
Well, it's a really good question. I was in a working session on a government committee this morning with a lot of people from industry. And I have to say, if you'd been listening, they'd have been saying, oh, this is really hard. You know, these radical things don't happen. And I reminded them, I said, well, you are correct, but you're also incorrect. We did work with a very, very famous large UK retail clothing store about 8 years ago. And they are doing exactly the same now as they were doing then. in the meantime, ASOS has come into existence. So radical does happen, but it tends to happen from small to big. Incumbents tend not to vote for radical change. But it's surprising how quick, I mean, in the car industry, everybody's looking at Tesla as an absolute disruptor, the most valuable car company in the world. Terribly overpriced, but I'm not giving financial advice. Disruption does happen.
Great. And then maybe one final one we can do live, and then I might ask you to answer the next ones by typing answers. So Charlie's asking, are companies ever resistant to the changes you suggest despite obvious gains for them? Is there ever surprising resistance?
It's only surprising if you don't spend as much time in the cynical world of business as I do. It is not surprising when they constantly, consistently refuse to do things that are good for them, including increased profit. I think it's a very fascinating thing to unpick as a researcher. Why are people not voting for an action that will generate profit?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. In the interest of time, we're going to have to move on, but there's another question for you in the Q&A there, so maybe you can type an answer to that one. And in that case, we will move on to our next speaker. This is Howard Griffiths from the Department of Plant Sciences. So Howard, please share your screen. There we go. And over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Eric, and thanks everybody. Great to be part of this this program. I never thought I'd find so many links. I'm interested to, I haven't thought of myself as a solar chemist before, and I'm interested to hear from Steve about that. I think his personal advice there to stop doing stupid stuff, I really need to adopt that, so thank you, Steve. But in the meantime, you'll see that I'm going to be talking a little bit about, that follows on from some of the topics that Steve mentioned, which will be to talk about plants and how plants use water. And then we'll think, what I'm going to then use is a case history or case studies, which are arising from a major program, which I helped to coordinate. And so I'm going to then try to illustrate how I think there are sustainability issues that we can advance in order to improve water use and improve the efficiency of people's livelihoods. And I'll be using that case based on around this program called Tigris, which is based in India, as we will see shortly. So at the largest scale, of course, it's recognized, I think, that at a global scale, we have a crisis over water supply and availability, partly because of the proportion of the population living in drier or semi-arid areas of the world, the proportion of those numbers and that have access to little or no freshwater resources, and the extent that population growth is occurring in those areas of the globe. And that then when we superimpose on top of those problems, the question of how we feed ourselves, agriculture is the largest consumer of fresh water. And of course, this is a major problem when we now superimpose on top of that the issue of global warming, global heating, and of course, the likelihood of increased extreme climatic events, which will further stress the system, the food production system. So that's the context for this overall study. And then coming back to where Steve came in, I guess, I promise I won't give you a 10-minute lecture on plants and photosynthesis and water use. But I would just pick up on Steve's point. Amazing that he's got his water use down to a litre for the production of a pair of jeans. But the one thing I don't think he's factored in is how much water was needed to grow the cotton in the first place. Because there's no getting away from that because of the fundamental proportions of water loss for every CO2 that's fixed by a plant, going through those amazing stomatal pores, which are the leaf pores in the plant surface. And they believe me, the reason I'm sort of, I suppose, so enthusiastic and fascinated by plants is the way that they feed us, they fuel us, and they clothe us. And in so doing, they also take up 15% of the global carbon dioxide pool of the atmospheric CO2 every year, and you see these huge exchanges of water. So that's the magnitude of the global scale of what plants do. But then what I think you may be able to see on the table on the right-hand side is bring it home a little bit closer to you about how much water is actually used in terms of the consumer products you utilize maybe on a day-to-day basis. And there I think is the real challenge, because of course it is so easy for us to perhaps visit a supermarket and acquire some of these items without thinking about where the water that was used in their production or their growth was actually sourced from, and that's the main point I want to come back to at the end of the presentation. So the program I'm going to introduce to you today has been funded through the Global Challenges Research Fund as part of one of their growing capacity calls. We've built a major consortium because of the association through my links through the Global Food Security Interdisciplinary Research Centre, and many of the partners that came together to form the consortium that put this bid together were drawn from that those interested parties. And what we've been able to establish is a major partnership with India, with a number of partner institutions, a huge number of co-investigators, and now we currently have around 33 postdoc researchers both in India and in the UK. And we have aims in order to improve sustainability, really responding to the challenge of the first green revolution. And that is, I suppose, captured in terms of the headline figures, as you can see here in this NASA image of the change in groundwater levels implicit in the surface of the Earth's surface. You can then predict what the absolute groundwater abstraction has been. And it has been absolutely significant in the last 2 decades, with tube wells now being bored in the region of Punjab and Haryana down to many multiples of meters in order to abstract water to support the cropping systems that are currently there. And in that region, they have what's known as a dual cropping system, which has been intensified over the last 50 years or so in response to the first green revolution, whereby, for instance, these they can grow winter wheat and also then change over in May, June to grow rice or maize in the summer. These crops are highly productive. They overcame some of the major problems with famine in India, which had hit the country successively over previous years, but they now brought with them their own problem in terms of this groundwater abstraction, reliance on pesticides, reliance on fertilizers, and then associative social issues which brought about increasing farmer debt and many other problems. The reason that these crops are so heavy on water is that they use bunded paddies, which means that the crops are irrigated, flood irrigated on a regular basis. So what I wanted to introduce you today was not just a small proportion of the work that we've been undertaking as part of this program. We're not going to talk about some of the policy work we're doing in terms of transforming rural trajectories, or looking at some of the fundamental work in how we might improve heat and drought tolerance in various key staple crops. I'm not going to go into any of the kind of research necessarily that we're doing in terms of food, nutrition and health and equality in some of the rural communities. What I want to focus on today is water use. And as you can see, and we'll run through some of these examples where we've been able to deliver some changes, we hope, to both practice and policy in terms of water use. So the first case history I want to present is work that's been taken by Rekha and Shailaja. And here they're working with communities in Maharashtra and looking at contrasting upland and lowland communities, going out, conducting surveys with those local communities to understand their cropping practices and the pressures upon those contrasting communities. And they're finding very great differences between the level of development in those communities, the extent that they can use rather larger scale irrigation devices, whether they're tending to grow contrasting crops. And so what we're starting to see is by engaging with rural populations and local communities, we can find out what the pressures are on those communities in terms of trying to generate income or just trying to feed sustainability issues. And this is also set against the framework of their type of water they might use to generate those crops. And there's a very different outcomes that we find in terms of trying to be able to encourage horticulture, different types of horticulture, different cropping systems, and also encouraging the way that some of the lowland farmers are able to take advantage of cash crops, provided that they've got sufficient irrigation. And there's a shift away from staple diets, as we see there in many of these areas, because of the slight variability that they're getting in terms of the rain-fed agriculture and the increasing reliance on groundwater sources and irrigation, but also to try to produce more crops that can be sold at the farm gate. And so there's changing balances within these rural communities, which are in association with the pressures of maintaining production in water supply, but also pressures in terms of finances and being able to support that form of agriculture. Now, some of my other colleagues on the programme, Cameron Petrie and Adam in archaeology, have been looking at an archaeological approach to understand how historical water use even as far back as the past 3,000 years have shaped farming practices within the various parts of these regions, and increasingly recognizing that in many villages and around many villages, there are water storage wells and tanks which have fallen into disrepair, which could be brought back in order to make the use of harvesting rainwater and modern surface water might be more sustainable. And that's been conducted in collaboration with colleagues at Punjab Agricultural University, where they have been looking at the possibility of training, talking, working with farmers to alter their irrigation practices, to move away from some of these flood irrigation systems, using technology to sense the water status of soils, and have brought about some remarkable changes in the water demand of these local farming. And they're absolutely astonishing. In 2 successive years, they've managed to save over 20 billion litres of water, which would normally have been used in flood irrigation systems. And this research, and this is the great thing about this program, where we've been able to see this fundamental research being translated then into policy, whereby a letter of understanding with the local regional Parliament has brought about the adoption of these practices at a much wider scale. There's also the use of these digital tools to improve the overall production system. And also in collaboration with the Punjab Agricultural University colleagues at IFM, JAG and Makis have been using modelling to actually model these groundwater systems to work out how sustainable this combined approach of both groundwater abstraction using canal water, and also how moving away, there's a great policy now shift to think about moving away from this dual cropping system to encourage more crops such as we saw in Maharashtra, where we're trying to produce crops that can be sold locally rather than necessarily take part in some of these major flows of around the country. And indeed, now JAG have been working on both farmer producer organizations, so local cooperatives, whereby the farmers effectively start to turn to market their own produce, and using models to develop the opportunities whereby by taking these improved production systems, the farmers can also improve their profitability by directly going to markets rather than relying on intermediaries. And so there's a really important, again, taking field studies, using modeling, and then translating that into actions. And I guess one of the studies that's come out in parallel with our particular work at the moment is one that's been, that I just highlight here, which is a really nice quantitative study on the virtual water flows between the states, because historically Punjab and Haryana were called the breadbasket of India, and they provided much of the grain for the rest of the country. Now, of course, what's being done now is that Alan Dangur, who's one of our advisors on the Tigris group, has been part of this really nice study, which has actually mapped the water flows that are associated indirectly with the growth of those crops, the production of those crops across the India. And then coming back to colleagues in IFM with JAG and Ettore, they've been mapping this at a national scale for India, looking at, again, this virtual embodiment, the virtual water flows associated with the trade of commodities between the UK and India, and putting the prices on these in terms of the physical prices of these quantities, these commodities. And of course, then the challenge then really is for us in terms of in the developed world to think about what kind of price or cost we want to put on that water that we might be using. And so there are frameworks you may be familiar with, the Hoekstra water footprint, and you can look at the way that we can calculate the overall use of water from various sources in the production of a given commodity. And we could, but I suppose finally it comes back to thinking about how we're going to actually face up to the fact that even if Steve has been able to reduce the amount of water that's used in production of some commodities like jeans, how can we actually cost in the water that is exported in those jeans that was actually used to grow the cotton? So just to finish up, I've added this. This is the astonishing team that are part of the overall Tigris program, for whom I'm extraordinarily grateful, and I've been able to misrepresent their findings so this afternoon. And I'm very, any apologies to them for whom I've not appropriately mentioned. Also, we have a fantastic management team that you can see there that keep us approximately running on the straight and narrow. And the final thought I'll leave you with is that, as I say, the next time you reach for that kilo of rice, I'm sure you won't eat a kilo of chocolate all in one sitting, but nonetheless, if you were to consume a kilo of chocolate, remember that represents, I think it was 1,700 litres of water. So absolutely amazing. Think how much water you're indirectly purchasing, and from the country that has provided that water. And I think that's a really important thing that we should take forward in terms of sustainable crop production for the future. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Howard, and thanks for giving us that overview of the Tigris program. That's really great. So anyone who has any questions for Howard, please ask them in the Q&A now. We've got one question or a comment here already suggesting that there are more than 50,000 farmer households are also unregistered traders. So how would you factor those in the Punjab specifically? How would you factor those people into these policy suggestions?
Yeah. Thanks. Well, that's a good question, and I think we've learned from some of the examples of some of the engagements of whereby we can work with rural leaders of local communities to actually take out and introduce both the modern techniques, the apps that may be available for them to use them for predicting climatic changes or markets and so on. And so there are opportunities for engagement that we hope we can develop. Great.
Thank you very much. A question from myself as well, while we wait for any other questions to come in. I was wondering, there's obviously the focus of this project is on India, but are the lessons from this project, can they be taken to other countries around the world? And are you looking to expand this beyond India?
Well, at the moment, we do have a parallel project that we're working partly with India and through in Ethiopia and in the Gambia, where we're looking at digestibility of millets and trying to improve nutritional availability. That's the Milneti project. So there are parallels. We can move forward. I left out one slide, which was from that UNESCO report on water use, which really showed how important it is across the world to empower females in terms of training and education, giving them the resources, using these catchment scale studies to work out the most efficient way of trapping and reusing and managing both green water and wastewater for cropping systems. So I think it certainly is applicable across many of these semi-arid areas.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Steve, do you have a question? You just turned your video on. I think you're unmuted.
I am going to respond. We did investigate the water on the cotton growing. And what we found was that cotton growers were at a very high risk relationship with the people who bought the cotton in bulk twice a year. If they didn't achieve a certain price with those people, potentially their family would starve. And so they're not going to take a risk of purchasing into drip feed irrigation systems, for example. So we set up a system which took the insurance risk on the drip feed. So effectively, we now have drip feed only cotton and have reduced the water And there's lots of other practices where they're overusing water far beyond what they actually need. So we've reduced the water in the field by about 60% as well.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Okay, if there's any other questions for Howard from the audience, then please do ask your questions, sorry, in the Q&A, and then Howard, maybe you can type answers to those when they come up. So thank you very much again for your great talk, and thanks to all our keynote speakers who've presented so far. So we'll now move to the next part of the symposium, where we've got shorter presentations from postgraduate and early career researchers from various groups and departments. And the first speaker is Pratheeba Vimalnath from the Institute for Manufacturing. So Pratheeba, hi there, please could you share your screen, and over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Can you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes, we can see it. Just, yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. And I must say it was really, really fascinating to listen to the previous 3 talks. And it was inspiring. I must say that before I start. So hello, everyone. I'm Pratheeba Vimalnath. I work as a postdoctoral research associate at the Innovation and Intellectual Property Management Lab, led by Dr. Frank Tietze at the Institute for Manufacturing. And the topic that we are researching on, or mostly focusing on, is the study of role of intellectual property in these green innovations. So be it managing the technical inventions you come up with, or be it managing the relationships with the supply chain partners or collaborative innovation process, we think the understanding of intellectual property and the role it plays is really important. Now, coming from the perspective of sustainability, of course, the experts here will be more informed about this than me talking about it. But looking at the Sustainable Development Goals, which identify the 17 key focal areas, we see a lot of initiatives emerging worldwide, be it at the policy intervention level or the changes of the business models, particularly the emergence of sustainable business models, or even the individual behavioral changes that we see. But from the innovation perspective, we see a lot of sustainability-focused innovations emerging. But what we notice is the development, the diffusion, and adoption process of these sustainable innovations involve complex and intertwined intellectual property-related challenges. We say that because if you take a company developing a sustainability-focused invention, the company can make strategic choices of keeping the invention protected through legal systems like patents, or even on the other extreme, keep it as a trade secret and not share it with anyone. Alternatively, on the other extreme, they can make a strategic choice of keeping the invention free, not protected with any patent protection rights, and share it with anyone who wants to use it free of cost without any restrictions. But in between these 2 extremes, what we also see is companies can protect their IP, but still choose to share it, what we call as a semi-open model, where the protection and the sharing aspect go hand in hand through sharing mechanisms like licensings, patent pools, or patent pledges, so which facilitates the diffusion of these technologies. So we see a range of options that a company can choose from, be it protecting their IP or sharing it with others. So there is a degree of openness in the choices they can make. But what we are not still clear about is which of these models will facilitate or hinder sustainability transitions, and whether do really IP is an important asset when it comes to sustainability, or like some claims it, is it like an open source based model like how we see in the ICT sector? Is it really important for sustainability? So we lack a lot of empirical evidence in understanding some of these questions. So as part of, I would say, a collection of research projects that we do at the IIPM lab, we focus on addressing some of these questions, particularly aiming to come up with an empirical evidence that can show what is the role actually the IP plays in managing these sustainable inventions and broadly contributing to sustainability transitions. So to begin with is the 3-year international and interdisciplinary research project called IPAST, where we are focusing on doing in-depth case studies with companies focusing on sustainability innovations, both social and environmentally focused technologies. And we understand the linkages among their IP strategies, business models, and sustainability impact to see what are the relevant IP models for sustainability and whether it facilitates or hinders sustainability under what specific conditions. And in another project, we also look into assessing the award-winning green inventions which has received European Inventor Awards by the European Patent Office, where there is a set of green innovations identified as having contributed significantly to sustainability. So we look into the IP strategies of these companies as well. And another recent project with European Commission, particularly for studying open innovation and see how IP can be used for facilitating or the open innovation process, where circular economy is taken as one of the value chains. We are doing case studies with companies focusing on circular economy to understand the IP aspects. And in another project, we also look into the IP for valuation of sustainable technologies. We know IP has traditionally been used for assessing the economic value of patents. But what we also see is whether IP can be a tool for understanding the environmental and social value of sustainable technologies as well. So these are some collection of research projects we are having in our lab, and I will present you findings from few of these projects. And also worth noting is, of course, we all know the COVID-19 pandemic, and Frank Tietze was part of this Open COVID Pledge. It is worth highlighting it because of the patent pledge route it has taken to make sure that any patents that is protecting the crisis critical products that is needed for treating COVID-19 is being kept free of patents and copyrights for people to access it and make it deliverable to those who in need. So in the next few slides, I will focus on presenting, I would say, a few findings from some of these studies. To start with, if you look at the patenting trend, so the question is, has the companies really started continuing the patenting trend, or has they started focusing on giving it free as many claims it? So this is a trend analysis done by Maximilian Elsen as part of his master thesis, who's currently doing his PhD in our lab. So as you see here, in patent system, we have this classification called WIVO2 patent classification, where the patents that are focusing on climate change mitigation technologies are classified during the examination process. And under WIVO2, there are several sub-classifications, as you see in the small table on the right, the 8 classifications, with the WIVO2E particularly focusing on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions related to energy generation, transmission, or distribution. So if you look at the trend on the right-hand side, what we see is the first graph on the top. Over the years, there is definitely an overall increase in the patenting activity in climate change mitigation technologies, and there is an exponential increase, especially post years 2010 and until now. And when we look specifically in the greenhouse gas emissions and related energy-related technologies, we see a similar trend where there is an overall increase and there is an exponential increase from 2010 onwards. So we do find IP as a key resource for protecting the inventions, because we see an increase in trend when companies file patents for these inventions. But what is not evident from this is how do the companies exploit these patents? How do the companies use it? So this is what the finding we've come up with from the IPAX research project, where we have done in-depth case studies talking to companies, understanding what do they really do with patents? How do they strategically use it to create impact? So we conducted about 35 plus companies out of the 4 research partners we have from India, Sweden, and Germany. But I have selected one specific case that I would like to present here to show how IP can be used as a tool to strategically manage the whole business to create a balanced economic as well as social and environmental impact. So this is a case about a company called Nutriset, which was founded in 1986, which is headquartered in France, but they were primarily focusing on fighting against malnutrition and nutritional autonomy for all in the global south, countries like Africa, India, so on. So this particular company manufactures or comes up with a formula for creating a peanut-based butter paste, which was recognized by WHO as a standard product for treating malnutrition. So what they have done is collaboratively, they have developed this project and developed this invention, and they patent protected it. And they created this concept called Plumpy Field Network, where the idea is to keep everything local. That is their motto of their business, like focus on local produce, that is grown, and the peanuts are actually grown in the local. For example, if it is in Africa, the concept is to grow everything in Africa and to give the product to the local manufacturers. And the local manufacturers will produce the product, which is then supplied to the people within that local community. So the whole idea was to keep the supply chain and the value chain, everything local. So it promotes local development. But there was one challenge, that if the developed country manufacturers are coming and selling the product in Africa, then this whole idea of local development and local produce and local value chain will get distorted. So the company has cleverly used this IP strategy such a way that they use the patent protection to deny access to the developed country manufacturers who wants to set up their manufacturing unit or produce it outside and bring it inside Africa. At the same time, they have actually allowed access to the local manufacturers through a simple licensing agreement. So their selective approach of denying patent access to a set of actors and allowing patent access to a set of actors helped them create an impact. It increased the local development as well as it increased the malnutrition beneficiaries within the local community. So in countries where this IP models, we know that intellectual property is differential across different countries. So in those countries where the IP was not seen as, I would say, strictly enforceable, they have followed this franchising model where the reliance was not more on patents, but rather they license their trademark and they use their branding of providing this quality product being recognized by WHO, etc., as their competitive advantage. So what we see from this case is this mix of semi-open models that is selectively licensing out and the closed model where denial of access to selected set of actors can help facilitate local sourcing and production for social sustainability with balancing the economic benefits that the company can reap out of it. So though there are several other cases like the battery recycling examples we have where they recycle to produce new materials, I think this is one case which shows clearly how IP, when strategically managed, will be really useful and tool for sustainability. So I will end with the key takeaway. What we learned from this initial preliminary studies, I must say, is IP definitely we see as a key resource for sustainability-oriented businesses. And it is a tool to manage sustainable resource flows because the companies can control whom they can license it to and whom not to. And IP, traditionally, it has been a policy instrument, but it can be a strategic instrument also for sustainability-focused innovation, especially when it is shared. And also we find that the traditional model of open approach for what we see in ICT is not something that we can apply as it is to the sustainability area as well, because there is also a need for economic development or economic growth of these emerging technologies. So we see striking the right balance between sharing and protection through adoption of the semi-open models like selective licensing seems to be the way forward, but we are a long way to go and we look forward to enhance our findings through further empirical evidence. So here are some publications from our research and we look forward to contributing more to the projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pratheeba, for a very interesting talk. We've got time for a very quick question before we move on. So there's a question here from Charlie who's saying, super interesting, is there a way to quantify the value of collaboration versus the value of competition in this?
Oh, that's a very interesting question because in fact, one of the cases which I have not presented here, this particular topic, especially in circular economy, for instance, if you're recovering a material from a waste, and if you want to feed it back into the, I can give a specific example of a battery technology, recycling technology, where they have recovered a material, but that material they thought it will replace all the traditionally used materials, which is they are in the competitive mode of using the material. But when they really entered the industrial ecosystem, the incumbents were hesitant. They don't want to take that material because they were a bit afraid that, okay, if we start using this one, their traditional materials will go out of place. So, and they have to change their internal infrastructure as well. So this kind of motivated the recycling company to rethink their business model, and they positioned themselves as a collaborator rather than a competitor. I would say a complementer rather than a competitor. So when it comes to quantifying it, so at present, we are only doing qualitative exploratory research because theoretical links along these lines are limited. But as part of our research where we focus on IP valuation, we are looking into patenting trend. And there is a possibility of understanding this collaboration versus competitive behavior through the technology class analysis, whether the companies work in the same technology field or different technology fields. So we should be able to quantify, I hope, if you do an analysis along those lines of similar versus diverse technology areas.
Great, thank you very much for answering that question. There's another question for you that's just come up, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, I think we'll have to move on, but can I ask you to type an answer to that question in the Q&A box? Question from Suresh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. So we'll move on then to our next speaker is Dr. Christopher Cleaver from the Use Less group. So Christopher, over to you, and you're already sharing your screen. Right, off you go.
Great, thanks a lot. So yeah, I'm Dr. Chris Cleaver. I'm a senior research associate in the Use Less group in the Department of Engineering, and I'm also part of the UK Fires EPSRC research program that's led by Professor Julian Allwood. Okay, so metals production causes a significant fraction of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. This basically boils down to steel, some aluminium, and then a sort of tail of other metals like copper, titanium, nickel, and so on. We know there are some very big challenges in making metals production zero carbon. Here's a few that have been identified by the IEA, the International Energy Agency. The production facility assets have a huge lifespan in this sector, so the kind of rate of change is very slow. High temperature process heat is really difficult to provide without combustion of fossil fuels in many cases, very high temperatures. And some emissions are difficult to avoid because they're due to chemical reactions that occur during the process. And then another thing is that international trade complicates things. So it makes it difficult for one government to solve the problem, say through regulation of their domestic production. And yeah, whilst all of these are really important and interesting issues, this talk is about something else that I think will help in a small way. And that's about reducing the amount of metal that's scrapped during processing. So it sort of links quite a lot to some of the things Steve was saying earlier. So by this estimate that I'm showing here from the IEA, about a quarter of all crude steel produced worldwide is scrapped during processing. And a significant proportion of that is scrapped during the process of transforming sort of basic steel items like sheets, bars or plates into useful things, so useful components. And reducing that amount of scrap would reduce CO2 emissions, at least by avoiding having to remelt it, and potentially by more if the scrap is not recovered. So here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. So one of the standouts really is car bodies. So on average, about 45% of the metal used to produce car bodies worldwide is scrapped. And the components that make up a car body are produced from sheet metal using a deformation process called deep drawing. And that scrap isn't just holes for the windows and maybe parts not tessellating well on the sheet that the material comes in on. It's mostly extra metal that's needed for the deformation process to work. It needs to be, the sheet needs to be gripped during the processing, and then that material is cut off. And I've just shown another example here, and I included this because I saw this heap of metal in person. It was about 3 years ago, and that's from a closed die forging facility that's making, in this case, transmission components, these crankshafts. So those are made by having a billet of material that's pressed between two metal dies, and extra material is added to the billet to make sure that the part is fully formed, and then that extra material it then squeezes out as the dies are closed, resulting in the big pile of metal. So it's quite a big problem, and in the Use Less group at the Department of Engineering, it's been one of our focuses over the past 15 years or so. In the group, we've researched and invented a number of metal deformation processes, and there's some pictures here of some of the equipment that we have in the group. And I want to go into more detail about two of the examples of some work that we've done. First of these is on a process for making metal ring-shaped components, and the process is called ring rolling. So there's an example of broadly speaking, what such a component might look like, often used in rotating machinery. And then these examples further down show the cross-section of the components that we might want to produce. And often what happens is that a ring roller will produce a large sort of metal donut, if you like, around the outline of the part that they want, or that's needed. And then the shape, the detailed shape, is made by cutting away the excess metal. And sometimes that can be more than 90% of the starting weight. And this was my PhD. This is my PhD topic. And early on in the PhD, I was thinking of ways how could we do this better. And I decided to visit an expert potter working with clay to see how she would make things like this. See what I could learn from this process. And hopefully, what you can see is that with relatively little effort, she's able to make like a step type feature, which it might not seem like it, but it's actually a really difficult thing to make by ring rolling. And she did it with her hands, and then I gave her these little rolls to see, was it something about the way she touched it with her hands or something? But it wasn't. And I gave her some other rolls to see if she could, what she could do with those. And it was really interesting what she could do. So after that, I and the team came up with a concept for a new machine arrangement for ring rolling, and it was based around some of the principles that we'd seen from the pottery throwing, and in particular that ability that she had to shape the part by making it grow in height. And the concept is shown here, and one of the key things that we added to the process is this set of rolls around the outside of the ring, labeled number 1, and we thought that we could use those to control the flow of the material as the forming process is happening, and that would allow, for instance, the part to grow in height and a shaped profile to be made. So this is the machine, and I'm going to show a video. It's a video of the machine in action in our lab. And what we're trying to make is this blue L-shaped cross-section. We're starting with a block of metal that's relatively thick-walled and has a small diameter. And first of all, the diameter will increase, and then those rolls around the outside will stop the ring from growing in circumference, and the shape will be made. So here we go. So at the moment, the ring is growing in diameter. It's reaching the diameter that's required, and that would be the normal kind of process that's done to make these things. And then this extra processing stage is now happening, and it might not look like it, but those 6 rolls are now really under applying quite a lot of pressure to the ring to stop it from growing in diameter, and it's growing in height. So overall, this is looking quite promising, and in this niche of metal forming, we're hoping it could have quite an impact. The second example I want to show sort of returns to car body parts, and this time it's very much in line with what Steve was saying, and it shows that significant improvements can be made even without inventive new processes. And this was some research that was done by a PhD student in our group who was funded by a car maker. One of the first things she did was to look at all the components that make up a particular car and identify the scrap rate. So metal comes in as a coil, and then is blanked into like an outline of each component that's just flat. And during that process, there's some scrap that's produced. And then it's deformed through this drawing process, and then the part is trimmed. And it's during that drawing and trimming phase that a huge amount of scrap was made. And the overall material utilization for this particular model of car was really quite poor. So industry best practice is about 70% utilization. And the student wanted to understand the problem a bit more, and she was able to convince sort of senior management in the company to set up a trial to reassess the design of 5 components as part of a refresh of the model. And this is the components that they looked at. The green area is the metal that ends up in the part, and then the blue areas show the blanking loss, and the orange is what's trimmed away as a result of at the end of the forming process. And the trial was carried out by a cross-functional team of engineers, so component designers, manufacturing engineers, and engineers who were responsible for sort of overall vehicle attributes like cost, weight, carbon emissions. And that team was able to identify simple design and manufacturing changes that would produce a 24 percentage points improvement in material utilization for all of these components. And she basically concluded that that was possible because previously material utilization hadn't been considered until the manufacturing engineering stage, by which point it was too late. And some of these changes were implemented, and they're now saving greenhouse gas emissions and money for the company. The rest of them just came in too late, so it was sort of a retrospective look at those components, and it was too late to implement the design changes. But I found this this really interesting work, and it's just a small pointer to how big this opportunity is. Well, that's the end of my talk, and thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really interesting stuff. I think in the interest of time, I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on to the next speaker, but there's a comment for you there in the Q&A, which you might want to type an answer to, and we'll carry on with the next speaker, who is Christian Pichler from the Reisner lab. So Christian, would you like to share your screen, please? And if anyone else has any questions for Christopher Cleaver about the previous talk, please type them in the Q&A as well. So over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen by now.
Yeah, you can, yeah.
Perfect. I'm a postdoc in the group of Professor Reisner, and today I'd like to give you a brief insight about how we can use sunlight to convert biomass into fine chemicals. The first question is, what types of biomass are there, and why should we use biomass to make chemicals out of it? I'm sorry. Yeah. So when I mention biomass, I guess most of you will think about stuff like sugar, starch, proteins, or fat and oils. But all of these products are valuable food sources. So if we use this for chemical productions, we should really only focus on waste sources of these types of substrates. Nevertheless, industry already uses these substrates quite in a big scale. For example, in Brazil, sugarcane is used for production of bioethanol, such as cornstarch in America. In Europe, we use corn to make biogas out of it, and you can use fat and oils to make biodiesel. Actually, the most prominent type of biomass on our planet is lignocellulose, or you could also call it wood and straw if you want. Per year, around 180 billions of tons of lignocellulose are produced every year, but humanity only uses merely 5% of it. So the question is, why don't we use more of this lignocellulose? Because especially lignocellulose is not in competition with food production, as are the as are the other types of biomass. The reason is lignocellulose has the highest chemical complexity of all the biomass types I mentioned. So lignocellulose consists out of lignin, which is a very complex aromatic polymer shown here, and cellulose, which is maybe better known. And cellulose is just a very long chain of these single glucose molecules. That means sugar. And sugar is a great resource for chemistry, so we can do a lot of things with it. That means if we could use more lignocellulose for chemical production, this is a great chance for new processes and new products. But at the same time, if we want to use lignocellulose, the complexity is a big challenge. And in our group, we are using photoreforming. That means the energy of sunlight. We want to make processes that can drive this conversion. Professor Reisner already talked about a bit the basics of photoreforming. So what we need for a photocatalytic process is first a photocatalyst, which is our special material that drives the conversion of the biomass into the product and at the same time can convert water into hydrogen. Of course, we need light to provide the energy for this reaction. In theory, this sounds very nice. However, if we want to use lignocellulose, we have one problem, that is lignocellulose and many types of photocatalysts are insoluble in water. If both components are insoluble, we cannot ensure a contact of the photocatalyst with biomass. And if we cannot ensure the contact, no reaction will happen. And what will happen is we will just throw powder into water, shine light of it, but nothing happens. So somehow we have to solubilize either one of the two components. Somehow I'm very sorry. I'll go back. Okay. So let's do it like this. Somehow we have to solubilize one of the components, and first possibility is to solubilize the biomass. This is a bit challenging with lignocellulose because this is a very recalcitrant substrate. Nevertheless, it is possible. And then the solubilized biomass can come close to the photocatalyst and be converted into the product. The type of product depends, of course, of the type of biomass used. Another possibility is we design special types of photocatalysts that are soluble in water. Then the photocatalyst can approach the biomass and actually chops down the insoluble biomass into smaller products, which are then soluble, and in both processes, hydrogen will be evolved. In the project I'm explaining today, we chose the first pathway, so we solubilized the biomass to make it more reactable. Normally, to break down, especially lignocellulose, very harsh conditions are needed. So we need very high temperatures, high pressures, and corrosive chemicals like acids and bases to make the lignocellulose soluble. However, we found an approach that allows us to solubilize the lignocellulose at much milder conditions. So we only needed 90-degree, slightly acidic conditions. However, we were using a special reaction medium. Our reaction medium was an aqueous solution, but with a very high concentration of salt. Actually, the salt concentration was more than 60%. That means we had more salt than water in this solution. Nevertheless, it still stayed liquid, but it had some very intriguing effects and properties, because this special reaction medium can dissolve wood. It can really dissolve the sawdust, which was our starting material, and then after the dissolution we can separate the lignin from the cellulose, because the lignin can be precipitated and we can remove it from the solution by filtering, and the only thing staying in solution will be the cellulose, and the cellulose is then converted into soluble sugars like glucose or fructose, and sugars are actually an excellent substrate for photocatalytic reactions. And here again, just to repeat the photoreaction, we start with the cellulose. Cellulose is chopped down into smaller sugars, and then the sugars react with our photocatalyst under light irradiation to our product. Actually, it was quite intriguing to see how our photocatalysts work under these reaction conditions, because not many people have tested this type of salty solutions for photocatalysis. The products we obtain are first hydrogen, which is an important fuel and commodity in chemical industry. And from the cellulose, we obtain mostly formic acid, which is an energy carrier itself, but also an important commodity chemical, which is used in textile industry or in industrial agriculture. And we obtain these two molecules here, which are called arabinose and erythrose. These are also sugar molecules, but they are much more valuable than the cheap cellulose or glucose starting materials, because they can be further processed in chemical synthesis to sweeteners and many other products. So now that we could prove that we were able to convert lignocellulose, what would be the next steps to proceed? So the first step would be, we need more active catalysts to speed up this reaction. Milder breakdown conditions would be also nice, because even though this reaction medium has fantastic properties, it also slows a bit down our reaction. And then a big goal is to develop more selective reactions. So instead of 3 products, what we get now, it would be great if we could only get maybe 1, but very high value product out of this process. And then of course we have to broaden our substrate scope, because I only showed you how to convert the cellulose part of the wood. But as I said, still lignin is a major component of wood, it makes up to 40%. And also, as mentioned previously, it would be really fantastic if we could convert plastics in the same type as we do, for obvious environmental reasons. So to conclude, and to give you some take-home messages, except for the fantastic chemical reactions I showed, lignocellulose is a very valuable substrate, and it should be really considered in chemical industry as a raw material. It is a bit complex to convert into chemicals, but if you do so, it has a very rich chemistry. And with the lignin stream on the one hand and the cellulose stream on the other hand, you can make a multitude of different products out of it. And we already could prove that we are able to obtain potentially valuable products just with photocatalysis. And if we are able to extend this principle to the conversion of lignin and plastics, I'm very optimistic that photoreforming has a good future ahead. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks for sticking to time as well. And that was a very interesting talk. And we've got time for a few quick questions. So there's a question here from Gary in the chat asking, what happened to your saline solution? Does that go to waste, or is it recyclable?
In principle, you can recycle it. However, we didn't perform the reaction on such a scale that recycling would be viable. But in principle, the salt will not be consumed in the reaction. Right.
Yeah. Cool. And a quick question myself. So you mentioned we need more catalysts as a next step. So are there any other, aside from lignin and plastic, any other catalysts that you think would be useful?
I mean, catalyst type wise, there's a very rich chemistry that can be used. There are these types of catalysts that Professor Reisner mentioned, which we can make from biomass, which are called carbon dots. We have these carbon nitride catalysts, which are also environmentally benign. And also there you can do a lot of chemical modifications to make just these 2 types of catalysts more reactive and faster. So there's still a lot of research going on in that field. Great,
thank you very much. There's another question for you just come in, which I might ask you to answer as type an answer to that question. Mm-hmm. And Christopher, there's also a question for you for the previous speaker as well. And so could I ask you to type an answer to that question as well, Christopher? And I just want to remind everyone in the audience as well that you can also ask questions of the pre-recorded talks. If you were able to see the pre-recorded talks before today, the speakers for those talks are also on the call today. So please ask them any questions as well through the Q&A. So with that, we'll go on to our next speakers, is Emily Servanté, also from the Department of Plant Sciences. So Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. So hello everyone, I'm Emily Servanté. I'm a 3rd year PhD student in Uta Pruszkowski's group in the Department of Plant Sciences. And I'm going to talk about arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which we research in our group. So these fungi colonize within plant roots. Most, up to 80% of plants, land plants that you see today will have this colonization with if the fungus is present. And the fungus has the canonical spores, which supports the majority of its life cycle and allows it to make these structures that you see within the plant root. So you have an extra radical hyphae, and hyphae are basically root-like structures of the fungus that allows it to form this structure on top of the plant root, which then begins its invasion inside the root, and ideally forming these arbuscules. So these are tree-like structures that are the thing we're most interested in, so the site of nutrient transfer. So the fungus gains nutrients such as phosphate and nitrogen for the plant, and in return the plant gives away some of its photosynthetic carbon, meaning that it's a mutually beneficial relationship between the two. And it also forms these vesicles which stores the carbon that it's gained from the plant. And this happens through a chemical dialogue between the plant and the fungus that occurs within the soil. So we're interested in this because, as I already said, that the plant transfers up to 20% of the carbon that it's made by photosynthesis to the fungus, and in return it gains that enhanced nutrient uptake. So the fungus can easily extend into the soil, meaning that it can get further than the plant roots alone can. So this is important because the relationship can be used as a form of natural biofertilization. So as fertilizers are running out, the sources, especially phosphate, and are also expensive and a form of greenhouse gases. That's why we're looking at trying to enhance this relationship for this natural biofertilizers. And fungi also contribute to carbon cycling within the soil. So whether or not the fungus contributes as a sink or a source is dependent on the environment and the community of plant and microbes within the soil. So say you start with elevated carbon dioxide, that enhances plant growth because it can photosynthesize and sequesters a lot of that above ground carbon into below ground sources, including the enhancement of having the fungus within the root. The fungus itself can sequester the carbon. It does this by having its own sources which last longer in the soil, and also by changing the aggregation of the soil for how the carbon is metabolized. So having the fungus there and having enhanced root growth will alter the plant physiology and also the community in the soil. So there's a lot of interaction between different plant species and microbe species within the soil that is changed by whether or not you have that colonization there. And having better plant growth will again increase the carbon sequestration. At the same time, it's found that having the fungi in the soil can also increase the decomposition of organic matter by attracting these microsaphotropes which decompose organic material. And this increases the soil nitrate availability, which is good for the plant and the community in the soil and that carbon sequestration. But at the same time, having that decomposition enhanced is also a form of carbon dioxide release, which means that the cycling of the carbon and whether it's beneficial as a sink or a source of carbon is dependent on those communities and the specific environments that you're looking at. So I've already said that we look at symbiosis because it's important, especially in low fertilization agrosystems, and it's a more sustainable way of fertilizing your plant than the typical application of large amounts of fertilizer. So the benefit that a plant gains from the fungus being there only occurs if that benefit outweighs the cost of giving away some of its carbon, which it needs for growth. And variation in how much a plant can benefit has been reported in different species, for example, in maize, where having the fungus there has enhanced its ability to gain nutrients such as phosphate, which helps it to grow larger. And in our lab, we look at predominantly at rice growth. And in my project, in particular, I'm going to look at lots of different rice lines to see if we can understand why some of them associate differently to the fungus, and the ones that have that enhanced amount of fungus colonizing their roots, which have a greater amount of plant growth or a relative benefit from that, and whether we can then breed that into our favorite rice lines to enhance that in agriculture. So the project was made because we had a change in we had this great project that compared 3,000 different rice variants. Here you can see them all and their different subpopulations, so that a large amount of diversity, and they're from 89 different countries. So they're genetically diverse and from across the world. Sorry, I think that's a printer in the background. And at the same time, usually we look at the fungus in the root through microscopy, which is really cool because you can see all the different fungal structures that I described in the beginning, but it's also very time consuming and destructive of the plant root, so it's quite slow to process. And a couple of years ago, a lab in Jena in Germany found that there's a chemical and metabolite made when the fungus colonizes the root, which can be detected by mass spectrometry, which is a much quicker way of quantifying how much fungus is in the root. So that was found for species such as tobacco, but rice had not been looked at. So the first part of my PhD was to check that that correlation was maintained, and that started by quantifying the amount of arbuscules by our normal microscopy technique, and then also looking at it by mass spectrometry and seeing if the correlation is maintained. And as you can see here, there's 3 different rice cultivars or rice varieties that are normally used in lab work, and the correlation is maintained in that case. I also collaborate with the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, and I obtained some diverse rice lines from them. You can see here they're all different subpopulations from different countries, and they're also cultivated in different ways, so they're quite diverse. And again, the linear relationship is maintained. So that correlation is present in rice, and it's really good news for me because it means that I now have a high throughput way of seeing how much fungus is in the root, meaning that I can compare lots of different lines. So the next step of the project is to get a lot of these lines. So I've chosen 200 diverse lines that I'll also get from the Philippines. And I'll again now use that mass spectrometry in the shoot to see how much fungus is in the root, and also look at those growth factors, so shoot biomass, nutrient composition, and identify lines that have a greater amount of fungus and are benefiting more from that, and try and look into the DNA to see which ones, what part of the DNA is causing that. And that means that you can integrate that into breeding lines, your favorite breeding lines, to produce the best lines for having this natural biofertilization, which will reduce the reliance on high input farming and the reduced pressure on irrigation systems that I didn't mention at the start, but this is applicable to upland rice, so not paddy, but upland rice varieties, and that increased potential for carbon cycling. So with that, I'll just acknowledge my group and Uta and all of her help in the project, and also my collaborators in the Philippines and in Germany in the Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology, and thank the BBSRC for funding the project. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Emily, and thanks for sticking to time as well. That was really interesting. So if anyone has any questions for Emily, please put them in the Q&A now. I was just going to ask a question myself. So, I mean, this obviously has implications for, improving agricultural sustainability and less reliance on fertilizers, etc. So do you think this could be applied for this technique of using this fungus? Could it also be applied in the UK and other places around the world?
So we have people in our lab looking at UK, they look specifically at barley, so barley in fields in the UK, in Norwich, and whether adding the fungus to the fields is helping with the yield outputs, in that case grain yield. You can also enhance the amount of fungus that would be in the soil in that case in a field trial by having different crops before the grain crop, which would enhance and help the next cropping cycle. So that is being looked at in the group, but it's all quite hard to implement, especially in field trials where you have all sorts of conditions that will also affect it. So it has the potential, definitely.
Yeah, great. That's really interesting. Okay, thank you very much. I think if anyone has any more questions for Emily, please just add them in the Q&A, and then Emily can type answers to the questions. And we're going to then move on to the next speakers. And I just was going to say that I'm going to stop the recording now, because the following two speakers have asked to not record their talk. So just so the audience knows that as well.